I don't exist. I played the guy that was free from concern so that people who watched me would be free from concern.
This isn't a joke. This isn't a comedian being dramatic. This is Jim Carrey, at the height of his success, realizing that the person he thought he was never existed. And what nobody tells you is this: when that realization hits, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like everything falling apart. Most people think spiritual awakening looks peaceful, calm, light, clear. But Jim Carrey describes it differently. He describes it as disorienting, uncomfortable, lonely, because awakening doesn't add something to you. It takes something away. It takes away the identity you spent your entire life building. Before Jim Carrey became awake, he was doing exactly what the world told him to do: chase success, chase approval, chase being special. He once said, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." Think about that. This is someone who won the game: money, fame, admiration, creative freedom, and yet something collapsed inside him. Not because he failed, but because success didn't save him. Jim didn't wake up during meditation. He didn't wake up reading a spiritual book. He woke up when the identity stopped working. The performer, the funny guy, the lovable personality. He realized he was exhausted because being someone is work, and the more successful the mask becomes, the harder it is to take it off. Jim once said, "I was always saying, I want to be somebody, and now I realize I don't want to be anybody." That shift sounds peaceful, but the moment it happens, it's terrifying. Because if you are not the story you tell about yourself, then who are you? This is where the dark side of awakening begins. It is the moment the spotlight on stage turns toward the audience and you realize the theater is empty. The ego doesn't disappear quietly. It doesn't go into the night with a handshake. It panics. When the mask begins to crack, your mind interprets the freedom as a threat. You don't feel enlightened. You feel hollow. You may feel empty, like a vessel with the bottom knocked out. Disconnected, watching your own life happen from a distance like a movie you've seen 1,000 times. Lost, realizing the map you've used for decades was for a city that doesn't exist. We call it depression. Jim calls it deep rest. It is your soul's refusal to keep performing a character that was never real to begin with. Jim described it as the terrifying relief of watching the character fall apart. He realized, I'm not the one experiencing the world. I'm the universe experiencing a guy named Jim. When that truth finally hits, the mind doesn't celebrate. It doesn't throw a party. It grieves. It mourns the death of the self it spent a lifetime protecting. It is a funeral for a phantom. But it is only in that silence, in that dark, cold room of the ego's death, that the real light has enough space to finally turn on. Many people confuse awakening with depression, and for a reason. They look identical from the outside, but they are polar opposites on the inside. Depression is the weight of a mask that has become too heavy to wear. Awakening is the moment you finally take it off. When your identity dissolves, the motivation that fueled your life collapses with it. The engines stop, the momentum dies. Why chase? When you realize there is no destination that can fulfill you. Why perform? When you realize the audience is just as lost as the actor. Why prove anything when there is no self left to defend? Jim Carrey didn't step away from Hollywood because he lost his talent. He stepped away because he lost his appetite for the illusion. He reached the summit of the mountain, looked at the view, and realized he had spent his life climbing a mirage. The game no longer made sense because he could see the wires holding up the set. He famously said, "Depression is your body saying, I don't want to be this character anymore. I don't want to hold up this avatar that you've created in the world. It's too much for me." Read that again. We have been taught to medicate the sadness, to distract the mind, and to push through the burnout. But what if the darkness isn't a malfunction? What if depression isn't always chemical? Sometimes it is existential exhaustion. It is the soul's way of staging a coup. It is your true self going on strike against the ego. It isn't the end of your life. It is the end of the lie you've been living. It is the deep rest required to transition from being a person who has a soul to being the soul that has a person. Here's the part nobody talks about. When you wake up, you don't suddenly feel connected to everyone. You often feel more alone, because the world is still playing the game, still chasing validation, still building identities, still afraid of silence. Jim once said, "People cling to their problems because they give them an identity. When you let go of that identity, you no longer relate the same way. You may feel like an outsider in your own life." People often say, "I don't feel passion anymore. I don't care like I used to," and they think something is wrong. Jim experienced this too. But what's actually happening is this. You're no longer fueled by fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of not being seen. Fear of being ordinary. Without fear, the old motivations die. Jim said, "I no longer feel driven by the need to achieve." That doesn't mean life is over. It means a different engine has to turn on. Every awakening passes through a void, a quiet, a nothingness. No goals, no identity, no storyline. This is the part most people turn back. They rebuild the ego because the silence feels unbearable. Jim didn't run. He sat in it. He said, "The absence of limitation is the absence of creativity." In other words, the ego collapses, but something deeper begins to breathe. Many people watched Jim Carrey interviews and thought, "He's gone crazy. He lost touch with reality." But what they were really seeing was this: a man no longer pretending, no longer packaging himself to be liked, no longer performing a character for approval. That's uncomfortable to watch, because it reminds people of the performance they're still in. Here's the twist. After the fear, after the emptiness, after the collapse, there is relief, not excitement, not bliss, relief. Jim said, "There's a peace that comes when you realize you don't have to be anybody. No more proving, no more chasing, no more pretending, just presence." Awakening is not becoming more. This is the biggest misunderstanding. Awakening is not becoming enlightened, becoming spiritual, becoming better. It is becoming less. Less identity, less resistance, less attachment to stories. Jim said, "I believe we're a field of energy dancing for itself." That's not poetry. That's someone who stopped needing a personal narrative. The ego survives by future and past. Plans, regrets, identity, awakening removes the timeline. And when the timeline disappears, so does the character. That's why awakening feels like death, because to the ego, it is. If you're watching this and thinking, "I feel disconnected. I don't care like I used to. I feel empty after success. I don't know who I am anymore. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not going backwards. You may be in the middle of what Jim Carrey went through, the collapse before the clarity. Jim didn't find happiness. He found truth, and truth doesn't entertain you. It quiets you. He said, I just want to be here now. That's all. No identity, no mask, no performance, just this. Awakening isn't beautiful. It's honest. And honesty feels terrifying before it feels free.